Have you ever looked at a map of the Kievan Rus? If you have, then you might have noticed a vast area on the southeastern edges of the map. This area in what is now southern and eastern Ukraine was never conquered by the Rus. In fact, for centuries after the fall of Kiev, the area was never majorly populated by any people at all, until the Zaporozhian Cossacks, or the Zaporozhka sich, in the late medieval ages. Now primarily populated by Ukrainians and Russians, this area was known by many names over the centuries, one of its most famous being the Wild Fields. Today you will learn about one of the least known areas in all of Europe, and what it meant for the Slavs of the East. The area of the Wild Fields resides on the Pontic Steppe, a region of low-lying grassland, little trees to be seen. This area cannot support such things like forests, but also is not so hot and dry as that of a desert. It is also hypothesized that this great steppe land was the birthplace of the Proto-Indo-European language. One of the first peoples to inhabit this region were the Scythians, an Indo-Iranian confederation. This group would dominate the area for centuries, later giving way to a closely related group, the Sarmatians in the 5th century BC. Masters of the horse in the steppe, these people would flourish for 1,000 years until the 5th century AD. Following this, many peoples would take the place as the power of the region. The Avars, Alans, Bulgars, Pechenegs, and then, finally, the Golden Horde. Following the death of the Khan of the Golden Horde in 1359, disaster struck the Khanate. Numerous civil wars and power grabs led to nearly 2 decades until 1381, which left the territory vulnerable for annexation. This opportunity was seized by the Lithuanians in the Battle of Blue Waters sometime in 1363 or 62, capturing much of the western wild fields in the Principality of Kiev. Though they would promptly shit the bed in 1399 and lose it all back to the Golden Horde, in effect, Lithuania losing their territory on the Black Sea and much of southern Ruthenia. Not even half a century later, however, we would see the Crimean Khanate break away from the Golden Horde, claiming a vast region of modern southern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. One thing to understand at this point is why exactly this area was called the Wild Fields. In this time period, the areas of central and eastern Ukraine were thinly populated. This was primarily the result of the frequent Tatar raids and the slave trade. This slave trade was so great in size that over 2 million Ruthenians, Russians, and Lithuanians were abducted and sold into slavery from Crimea to the Middle East, but more specifically, the Ottoman Empire. The slave trade was in all ways the driving force of the economy of the Crimean Khanate. We get such a watered-down version of such events that us in the modern age do not really understand the barbarity of those times. Constant raids, pillaging, abduction, not to mention this is the continuation of the Golden Horde and the Mongol Empire from centuries earlier. So, who in their right mind would want to live in the wild fields actually controlled or just bordering such a country? If your fellow villagers and family are getting abducted even as far as Valonia, then why would you trek further into such a place? Well, in the 1400s this would all begin to change, originating as serfs who escaped from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The Zaporozhian Cossacks became their own force to be reckoned with. These Cossacks would begin to settle the wild fields, destroying Crimean Tatar bases, armies, and markets in their wake. Primarily sailing down the vast amount of rivers of the now current Ukraine, over centuries the Cossacks would continue to gain power, and with that more runaway serfs would begin to majorly populate the region. It was a slow, bloody process. The status of the Cossacks' loyalty was complicated, whether it be in alliance with Russia, Poland, Lithuania, or by themselves. These people were under very limited control from outside forces. They even raided such places as far as the outskirts of Constantinople and other Ottoman territories. Due to all this pressure, the wild fields began to shrink. Slave raids became harder. Invasions by the Tatars were all but abandoned. Still, however, there were some small areas that remained, primarily being that of the Kuban region east of Crimea and a small strip of land north of it. By the time of the late 1600s, the Crimean Khanate was in steep decline, and by the early 1700s, the slave trade was all but dead. It would never become a power that it once was, finally succumbing to the Russian Empire in 1783. The Zaporozhian Cossacks were disbanded just a few years earlier in 1775 by Catherine the Great, with many of these same Cossacks being sent to the southeast to the Kuban and Don River regions in the Russian empires attempted to control that land as well. And so ends the story of the Wild Fields, a land of tragedy, freedom, and in many ways the Wild West of the East Slavs.